That is fair. Yeah, we're going to go alphabetically. So we'll start with the Houston Rockets. I feel like you can ask a ton of questions about this team just because it's a roster that's in so much flux. I wanted to focus on whether they're willing to extend Kevin Porter Jr. and or Jae'Sean Tate. Porter's able to receive up to $184 million in an extension. Tate would be around $60 million. Obviously, those are big numbers, and they're not going to get the full scope of those extensions. But if they do come to terms, how much would it be for? And are they even going to come to terms? Because beyond Jalen Green, I don't know who Houston views as a true building block for whatever the next competitive iteration is, which is why I'm focusing on these two guys, because they're candidates, even if Porter is coming off a pretty disappointing season, and even if Tate is ultimately limited to more of like a higher end role player ceiling. Do they view these guys as long-term pieces for the organization?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And the extensions specifically are tough, because what do you want to give Kevin Porter Jr. knowing that he's not, we've seen it, but him at point guard is not the answer. He's probably best off as sort of a microwave player off the bench. I think Jae'Sean Tate has a ton of value for his defense, and we know that these wing types, even if they're not the best shooters or the best offensive players, they're going to get some money in free agency. And so I could see numbers or the justification behind drawing a line in the sand and saying, if they're willing to sign for X, we'll keep them. But you're also so early into your rebuild that you don't want to lock yourself into any deals that are too steep. And I would be curious as to who they value more moving forward between those two. And I agree with what you said about Jalen Green kind of being the only tentpole prospect. Alperen Sengun probably comes closest, but does that change with, we said we weren't going to reference the draft, but they're in a spot to take one of the three bigs that are viewed as the consensus top prospects in these drafts. How does that change Alperen Sengun's value to this team, his future trajectory with this team? Still, those two players, and you have the unknown in Usman Garuba. There's long-term foundation pieces here, but I don't think that Tate or Porter Jr. is necessarily one of them. I think this is more so a matter of, if you can get them cheap enough and they can help us, or these are deals that they can be moved later and they're actually more helpful at a more expensive number than these sub $2 million salaries they're working on right now, or sub $4 million in KPJ's case, that could be a value play for them.
I have to admit that I totally misfired on KPJ. I thought that going into this season, I thought he was just going to explode, actually be the answer to that point guard question. Couldn't have been more wrong. It didn't work. And then some.
And that's not supposed to be his game either. And I think it's, he might be more useful to them knowing what we saw from Jalen Green over the second half of the season. I don't think Jalen Green's a primary initiator type, but maybe he can be your 1B. And so now you just have to focus on finding more of a floor general to go with him. And you can still have room for someone like KPJ. I don't know what the number is that you'd feel like if he wants, mid-level money in his extension, or you're giving it to him $11-12 million a year.
Yeah, I think you would.
I probably would. Jae'Sean Tate, who do you view as more valuable to them though between those two?
I think KPJ ultimately is, because of the ceiling, where I think that's a few levels higher. Tate, while a good role player who can fill a bunch of different roles, provides energy, provides enthusiasm and intensity, that's the easier role to go out and find on the cheap. It's harder to find a cheap version of what Porter does in theory. But I think you're still at a stage of this rebuilding process where you can feasibly chase that upside, knowing that it could backfire.
I just wonder if not having a building block wing on the team, maybe aside from Tate, Garuba's not a wing. Garrison Matthews isn't really a wing. I just don't you have Jalen Green. I'm just wondering if that factors into it at all. And knowing even if you have KPJ, you're going to have to go out and find someone else who can be a primary ball handler anyway, if that sort of diminishes his long-term utility to this squad.
It definitely could. And really either of these players could go either way. It's a good question. I think I don't have an answer, because Houston could very feasibly go in any direction with these players.
If I had to guess, I would say Tate's more likely to get an extension than KPJ. I don't think either.
Just because of the numbers, right?
Right. And I don't think that either of them get extensions personally, but who am I to say anything? My question for them is, are they going to move Gordon and or Wood this offseason? And then you can throw, or you could fold John Wall into that. I still think $47.3 million salary, that's going to end in a buyout, unless the Lakers decide they want to give up a pick with Russ for John Wall, which makes zero sense for them, in my opinion. I think I'd be curious to see who has more value around the league. It's probably Wood, just because he's younger and he's more of an anomaly at his position offensively. But Eric Gordon was really good this year, man. And just the rim pressure he puts on, the shooting, someone who can hold up defensively. Yes, he's getting older. Yes, he's had his injury issues. Yes, he has that non-guaranteed $20.9 million salary for 23-24. You happily pay that salary if he makes an all-star team or you win a championship. So I get it why Wood, though, would be more appealing, especially where they are, though, in the draft order now. I'm not a big fan of drafting for fit this early in the process or building your team necessarily for fit. But when you have Şengün and it's really time to uncork Aruba and you're about to get one of those three bigs, and you know that Christian Wood's going to command, he's extension eligible too. He's going to command a ton of money, or at least more money than he's making right now, probably, if he gets to free agency, and that you really shouldn't be bankrolling that next deal. He feels like the guy that should absolutely be moved, because it's less egregious if you just look, if you house Eric Gordon for the rest of the season and kind of just let him come off your books. I think he's might technically be the more useful player in a lot of circumstances, but it feels like you can get more compensation for Christian Wood. And so you might as well just go out and get that compensation whilst you can.
Totally agree, but I feel like we're going to see both players moved. And I say that knowing full well that I was downright shocked that Eric Gordon wasn't moved at this past trade deadline. He seemed like maybe the most obvious player to be on the move, just because of what he brings to the table as a guy who can put pressure on the rim, a guy who can, feasibly launch away from a foot or two beyond the 3-point arc, a guy who played pretty pesky on-ball defense. And he was ready to go to work for a contender, it seemed. And for him to stay in Houston was pretty shocking. For the same reasons, I don't expect him to remain. Plus, Jalen Green's second half breakout. The ball's going to be in his hands even more. If they do keep KPJ, they're going to want the ball in his hands too. So it feels like there's an even smaller role in store for Gordon if he stays. So I would think they're going to get something for him, knowing that, if he's on the roster, like, sure, he might speed along the development of some of these younger guys, but he's not going to be contributing to a playoff team.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point as well. I don't know how much, do you want a strong veteran presence in the locker room? Again, it seemed like Eric Gordon wanted to suit up for a contender too. And so he actually just might be the more likely to get moved by virtue of his age and how counter to the quote unquote timeline, how much he runs counter to that for Houston. And also, look, they have Josh Christopher, who gave him some nice minutes too. And who knows what they can end up. Look, if they bring Dennis Schroeder back, or if they wind up with, getting someone else out of the draft, or an undrafted free agent that they signed, or they want to give more reps to, they might just decide to go the all-in youth route, or organically just having other options. So you kind of talked me into Eric Gordon being more likely to get moved. I think both of them should be, because Christian was not someone you look to as like the steadying veteran leadership presence anyway. So I think you should be fine to get rid of him, especially when, I don't know, I think bigs of his caliber might be a little bit more in demand than we think, because of the way we've seen playoff teams play, where it's not necessarily downsizing, but you have bigs who can play a smalls game on offense and defense. Christian Wood cannot do the latter, but he can certainly do the former. And so a team like Charlotte, would they be willing to give up real value to get him, even though he doesn't stabilize their defense? Maybe the fact that I can't just rattle off a bunch of different suitors for him off the top of my head speaks to that his value might be lower than we actually think. But given how anomalous, to use the word again, his offensive skill set is at his position, if you're going to use him at the 5, it just feels like there will be a team where you're going to get more than just a first round pick for him.
Yeah. If you had to bet, which of them or both or none gets traded?
I'm just going to say both.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm at too.
There's going to be enough top end talent in Houston now too, when you look at this year's pick, Jalen Green, to say, okay, we can just turn the keys over, sort of what OKC did. And our veteran presences are going to be a Derek Favors or a Mike Muscala, a much cheaper person than an Eric Gordon or a Christian Wood, especially because it's going to be a veteran who doesn't have the leverage to want out. I think Eric Gordon's good enough to want out.